I'm Terri Savelle. I'm so glad you're watching today. I want to talk to you about getting your bounce back. I looked up that word bounce, and it actually means to move quickly back up after hitting the surface. One translation said to hit against the surface and quickly move in a different direction. Another said to move with a lot of energy and excitement. What am I saying? Satan is your enemy, and he is out to get your bounce. He wants to get the bounce right out of you. So many times you feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall. Sometimes it feels like you're going after a dream. You've got a goal in your heart. You've got something you're believing for, and it just feels like you keep hitting your head against the wall. Nothing's happening. Well, I believe it's time for you to get your bounce back. And your enemy, Satan, he would love nothing more than for you to feel down, defeated, deflated, and absolutely unusable. But I've discovered if you want to be successful, you have to get your bounce back. You have to learn how to bounce back after adversity, after difficulties, after you experience defeats. You got to learn to bounce back. Sometimes it's helpful to just hear stories from other people who've had rejections, who've experienced difficulties, even delays, things that look like they're never going to happen, but they stayed focused on their dream. In fact, I was reading this encouraging story about the actress Janine Turner. Now, I thought this was really interesting because listen to her story. She said from the time she was 15 until she was 27 years old. Let that sink in for a minute. 15 to 27 years old. She said she auditioned for movies, sitcoms, commercials, on average 4 times a day. That's hard for me to even comprehend. She said she added up her rejections, and she estimated about 1,000 rejections that she received during those auditions. But she said she had to learn to keep bouncing. In fact, she said she got down to $8 in her checking account. Now, she could have thought, obviously, this isn't the plan God had for my life. Can you imagine someone telling you over and over and over, you're not what we're looking for. You're not pretty enough. You're not talented enough. You're not qualified. You're not the one for this part. Over and over and over, got down to $8 in her account, and all of a sudden, a producer called her and said, we're starting a series called Northern Exposure, and we think you're the right one for the part. Well, she took the part, of course, and it changed her entire destiny. Well, I've discovered that every bounce is getting you closer to your destiny. In fact, the harder you hit, the higher you bounce. But you got to learn to bounce back. What would have happened if she'd given up after all those rejections? In fact, I was reading something about scientists who were taking bumblebees up in space to do research on weightlessness on these bumblebees. So they said they took them up in the air. They're studying these bumblebees, watching how they, adapt to weightlessness. And think about it. These bees weren't having to flap their wings, not having to, exert any kind of effort. And so it looks like life is good. They're just coasting around. I'm sure the bees thought, dude, we were made to live like this. But then it said on the 4th day, they all died. Well, the researchers concluded that the bees were not designed to live without resistance. In fact, the resistance prepared them. It strengthened them. Well, it's the same with us. We weren't created to live without resistance. The resistance that you're facing, maybe the rejections, the delays, the disappointments, it's preparing you. It's strengthening you. And no, it's not fun, but it actually prepares you to go to the next level. I love hearing different stories from people who talk about what do you do while you're waiting and while you're experiencing this. Because a lot of times you can take it personal and think, I'm the only one that's had to struggle this hard. And that's what Satan would love for you to think, is to get that victim mentality where you just feel like, everybody else just pursues their dreams. Why is it taking me so long? Well, nobody ever goes from plateau to plateau to plateau. In fact, I heard Joyce Meyer, she taught this message about shepherds. It was all about Psalm 23. And she was talking about when shepherds lead their sheep, that they don't go from mountaintop to mountaintop to mountaintop. She said, in fact, the shepherd leads the sheep through the valley to get to the next mountaintop, through the valley to get to the next mountaintop. But she began to explain, it's in the valley. That's where you're strengthened. That's where you're prepared to make it to the next mountaintop. You think about it, every hard time in your life, that's probably when you've drawn the closest to God. That's when you've cried out to Him more than ever. Well, the valley is what prepares you for the mountaintop. So I want to encourage you today, whatever you're dealing with, a certain dream, a certain prayer that you have, something you're really believing God for, don't give up in the valley because it's preparing you for the mountaintop. I read a story not too long ago about Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, at 21 years old, he founded Apple Computer. Well, of course, it took off. He became very successful, known all over the world for this global brand. 7 years later, he clashed with his board of directors. Well, eventually, they fired him from the company that he started. Think about that. How painful would that be? He said at first he felt betrayed, he felt wrong. And he said, I didn't just sit around feeling sorry for myself and just wallow in self-pity. Instead, he went out and learned some new skills. So he eventually started a different company. Well, all of a sudden, Apple needed the company that he started. They purchased it, brought him back as the CEO. But listen to what Steve Jobs said. If I hadn't been fired, I would have never learned these new skills that have made me into who I am today. Well, I believe that whatever you're going through right now, it's preparing you for the next phase that God has for your life. So don't allow the devil to give you that victim mentality, feel sorry for yourself, give up on a dream, wallow in self-pity. Just know that it's preparing you for something even greater. In fact, I heard a story about another guy who, he said he worked at a home improvement construction type company for 30 years. In fact, he helped them from the ground up. He was one of the executives there. Well, all of a sudden they began, restructuring the company, and they terminated his position from this company he helped from the ground up. Well, same thing. Instead of feeling sorry for himself and thinking, great, I just invested 30 years of my life with this company and then basically I'm fired, they terminate my position. Instead, he thought maybe this is my moment to go after my dreams. So he got together with some of his friends and they started their own company called Home Depot. Well, think about it. If he had never been terminated from that position, he could have never tapped into his full potential. Well, maybe the same thing in your case. Don't get discouraged. Don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't compare yourself to other people. God's preparing you. He's strengthening you. He's enabling you to go to the next mountaintop. So I want to encourage you today to get your bounce back. Keep listening to podcasts. In fact, I encourage you to push that little button. Subscribe to this podcast so you can stay motivated. Faith comes by hearing, right? So every time you hear the word, faith comes. Well, thank you so much for watching today. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter so I can keep you motivated to achieve your dreams. I'll see you next week. I believe that what you do at the beginning of the year sets the tone for the rest of the year. That's why I'm excited to invite you to the next conference. That's our Success Conference here in Plano, Texas, January 20th and 21st. This is going to provide all the tools you need to help you succeed in life, in ministry, or business. My special guests this year include Esther Federkevich. She is one of the best literary agents, publishing experts. My other guest is Billy Epperhart. Now, he is an amazing success teacher. He teaches at Andrew Womack's Business School, and he's going to help you learn how to build wealth. Now, you have to register quickly. I believe we're going to sell out again this year. Space is limited. Tickets are going to sell out fast, so be sure and register for the next conference.